Hello and welcome to I'll Knit If I Want To. I'm Andrea of Andrea Renee Knits, and today I am wearing the Weekender with some brand new pants I just finished last night. These are the berry pants. They are my favorite pants pattern. I will link them below for you. And I made them out of this incredible ice-dyed fabric that my amazing friend Kate dyed up for Spin Cycle Supply Co. Spin Cycle Yarns, brick and mortar, not moiter, mortar shop. Now it just sounds weird. That has both yarn and fabric and fun notions and everything. So Kate went on an ice dyeing spree and actually dyed up bolts of fabric doing ice dyeing, and I'm obsessed. So I actually also, out of the yardage, was able to sew a top, and I have a pair of shorts that I'm gonna sew up next that are already cut out, that are gonna be a little more hodgepodge because I kind of had to get creative with the amount of fabric I had left. But it's been super fun. Sorry, my headphones were just dinging at me, so now fingers crossed. You're hearing me one way or another. Let's just cross our fingers that it's good sound. There we go. But I am starting to realize the seasonality in my non-knitting making. So I am 100% a year-round knitter. Even if it weren't my job, knitting is my just go-to. And temperatures, seasons do not deter me from my knitting. But I got really into sewing around this time last year as well. I am sure part of that is Me Made May influence, seeing everyone's amazing hand-sewn outfits and whatnot that everyone posts during the month of May. So I think that's a factor, but there is just something about spring and summer, and also just being able to make something that I can do in an afternoon. Be like, I made a pair of pants in like half a day. Whereas with knitting and spinning yarn, it's obviously much more of a slow process, which is great, but it's nice to balance that out. And my poor wheel is just languishing. I am still working on that project that I've told you all about for a while. It's going to be a 3-ply yarn using 3 different fibers. And yeah, between my knitting deadlines and now the obsessive sewing I've been doing, it has been neglected. But I know I'll get back to it, and it'll be there when I'm ready to. So that's the great thing about making is a lot of people, even with knitting, you go through a little bit of like a roller coaster of motivation with making. And I hear all the time people lose like their sewing mojo or their knitting mojo, and then they get it back, and you're just like, it's the best thing ever. So I always just trust if I go through a dry period with one of my crafts that like I know it's gonna come back when I need it. So anyways, that is what I am wearing today. Today is also the kickoff of the Straya Hat Weekend Knit Along Challenge, also known as the Spring Weekend Knit Along Challenge. I think I've called it like 800 different things. I'm realizing organization, which you might be able to see. Just don't look behind me too much, because if you could see my desk, it's just a little chaotic up here. I think that I have realized about myself, I lean a little bit into like that chaotic, artistic, creative tendency of just like making a mess when I am in kind of like a creative mania where I'm just like, I have to make all the things. But then after a little while, I'd make myself tidy it up. But I would love to be a little bit better at organization. I just think what it comes down to for me, and maybe those of you out there that are just like super organized can share some of your knowledge with the rest of us in the comments. But I think what I have realized about myself is what happens is I'm like, oh, I should really put away the 100 skeins of yarn right here and over there and over there. Oh, there's my finger. I mean, it is kind of crazy in here right now. There's like cut paper sewing patterns and a lot of fiber. I mean, it's just kind of crazy. But every time I'm like, oh, I should really do something about this. And I'm like, or I could knit a few more rows or spin for 10 minutes or make something at my sewing machine. That's what gets me. So anyways, I digress. Let's answer some questions. Oh yeah, I'm very distracted right now. The knit along challenge started today. So it's cast on day, yay! And I thought I would throw out a couple tips at the beginning of this episode. For the Straya hat, it is a half fisherman's rib hat. Of course, it is downstairs in my bedroom. It is not up near me, so I cannot hold it up because that's just the way it goes. That whole organization thing. But I do have an entire playlist here on YouTube for my half fisherman's rib tutorials. They're also linked in the pattern on page 3. And I posted them at the top of the actual knit along forum if you're participating over in Ravelry. So I've tried to kind of scatter them all around. But those are going to be super helpful. Another question that I get all the time is fixing mistakes in half fisherman rib. Really, I think, especially for this weekend, my best advice would be to use lifelines. I've talked about them a lot on here. But basically a lifeline is when you just put in, I like to use embroidery floss. You could also use really smooth yarn. You just don't want to use anything fuzzy. And you just pull that thread through all of your live stitches along the cord of your needles. And you just leave it there, tails hanging out the end. And that way, if you do make a mistake, you can pull your needle out and just drop down, just frog, just pull, and nothing can go below where you put that thread. And then you just put your needle back in and continue working from there. The tricky thing about half fisherman's rib is there's not, especially when you're new to it, it's just a little tricky to see what all those different stitches are meant to be. And also what happens is it kind of splits itself like a double fabric when you pull the needles out. So you're gonna have your stitches, instead of just being like just hanging out little soldiers like in stockinette where you could just put your needle back in, they kind of like push some to the front and some to the back. That being said, if you do need to pull your needle out to tear back a little bit, the good news is with a hat, even if you attempt it and it just doesn't work, you can always undo it and just start over. It's a smaller project, so just, you know, I spend so much of my life undoing projects that maybe that's also easier for me to say because that's such a part of my work that I am not afraid to tear something out and start again. That's a great thing about being a knitter, right? But if you want to try, my tip for tearing back would kind of be twofold. I would recommend getting back to I was going to say a right side row because I'm working on an inclinations cowl right now for my daughter, which is also downstairs. Darn it. 2 for 2 today. 0 for 2. That's what's 0 for 2. So it has a right side and a wrong side. Straya hat obviously doesn't, but you want to go to a row that you have just worked the knit one below purl one, not the purl row. Because the purl row, you can't really get back to a purl row because you've already done like the knit one below and that disrupts the purls. It will make more sense as you do it. And then my other tip for tearing back in general, what I always do is I take out my needle. When working in the round, I think it's really helpful to place a stitch marker, like decide how far you want to tear down and put a locking stitch marker at your beginning of round. That way it's a lot easier to refine that spot. Sometimes it can be tricky to see where your beginning of round is and you don't really want to lose that. So I place that, pull out my needle, and then I tear down to 1 to 2 rows, 2 if you're feeling nervous, above the row I actually want to be at. And then I put my needle back in and then I unknit that 1 or 2 rows more. That way I know I'm not going to lose any stitches. I'm going to make sure everything gets back on my needle, and I feel like it gives you a really solid baseline to then get back to the knitting part of it. So I just, once my needle's back in, I follow the path of my yarn. I stick my yarn into the stitch that I'm unknitting, and then I pull the yarn out to unknit it. And I just keep doing that all the way around. It'll also help you see kind of the anatomy of those stitches again and figure out exactly where you are. But placing a lifeline and being able to mark in your pattern what row you place that lifeline on is just really gonna help it to be a less kind of stressful situation. And as I have said in the past, the thing I love about lifelines is it gives you the freedom to attempt to fix your mistakes, even if you're trying to just drop down one column of that half fisherman's rib. You can do that and you don't have to worry at all if you mess it up, because worst comes to worst, you just go back down to where you have your lifeline and put your needle back in. So it really gives you the freedom to tinker around, and that is the way that you will learn for yourself how to fix mistakes in whatever stitch pattern it is that you're working with. So I am a pro lifeline user. I think it's really, really helpful. All right, let's actually get to some questions now that I've just been chitty-chatting. Oh my gosh, for so long. All right, sorry everybody. I am obviously a little chowder today. All right, speaking of my daughter's inclinations cowl, I was wondering if you have any tips on resizing it. The shift cowl was one of my first projects a few years ago back as a new knitter. I didn't know about gauge swatching and I was knitting very tightly, so it came out smaller than in the pattern. I love it. I love that it's closer to my neck like a bandana, and really would like to have my inclinations cowl turn out slightly similar. She didn't say slightly similar, or they didn't say slightly similar, they just said similar. Just throw it in my own words. Because the cowl uses a US needle size 3, I don't really have the option to go down a few needle sizes to achieve this. Do you have any recommendations on making it smaller or even bigger for folks that might want the opposite? So I do. I think that what's nice about the inclinations cowl is the part I would resize, you can leave the depth the same. So the first section has you working until the first edge of that cowl is a certain depth, and you can look at your schematic. So I wouldn't adjust that. I would just leave that as is. Then section 2 is building up the length. So that's the part that wraps around your neck that makes the circumference of the cowl. So that is where you would want to adjust it, and it won't affect the rest of the pattern. It will affect how much yarn you use. So always keep that in mind. Anytime you are doing modifications in a pattern, you're going to affect how much yarn you use. So especially if you want to make it bigger, that's when you'd really want to make sure you had purchased some extra yarn so you don't run short. But so for this, you could just work to a lesser length to make it smaller. And so what I would do, the thing about half fisherman's rib is it really, really grows after blocking. So you might want to knit a swatch and do your I think I listed in that pattern. Actually, I listed the pre and post gauges, like pre-blocking and post-blocking. So you can use that as a starting point if you were able to get gauge. Then you can just deduct, I feel like I'm overcomplicating this. Basically, you just want to knit that second portion to a shorter length, and you can just kind of try. So what I've been doing for my daughter is I like hold it up to her and just wrap it around, and I make sure it feels good around her neck and everything, because my daughter really doesn't like anything close to her neck. And so we're making sure that it's going to be loose enough for her. Back to ripping things out, following my own pattern. You know, I so rarely get the chance to just like knit something willy-nilly. And so I, of course, used my hand spun, which is a different weight than what the pattern calls for. And I knew I wanted to make it smaller for her. And so I was like, well, I'm just going to wing it. And I was basically so close to being done and was going to run out of yarn. So I had to tear back to like almost tear out completely. So I am now reknitting it. So that might be part of the process of figuring out the perfect size for you. But you can absolutely just knit it shorter, or if somebody wanted it larger, they could absolutely just knit that section 2 longer to get a bigger circumference of the actual cowl. And yes, it is on a size 3 needle, but you could go down. So if you just want it to be, because you might have also liked with the shift cowl that the fabric would have been a little stiffer if you're knitting it at a tighter gauge, so you might have enjoyed that structure. So you could consider going down to a US 1 or 2. Heifer Sherman's rib is knit on a much smaller needle than what you would typically imagine because of it's such an expansive fabric. So you could grab a sock needle and really just knit it at a tighter gauge too. But I hope that gives you a good jumping off point. All right, and next question. I had a question on how hand knit socks are supposed to fit. Are they supposed to feel loose and slide down, or should they feel tight and be hard to get on? Specifically, how should the DRK everyday socks fit? My gauge matches what the pattern calls for, but the ankle leg portion slides down slightly. Is that normal? So generally, I mean, I will just start by saying fit is always personal. It's whatever feels best on you. For myself, I want my socks to be snug. I want my slippers a lot of times to be a bit looser. So for slippers especially, I have one of my first patterns was the Wanderer slippers, and those are like tall slipper socks. They're knitted with worsted weight yarn, and they're meant to be looser and kind of slouchy and just really cozy. But generally socks, you want them to have up to like an inch of negative ease so that they do feel snug. And especially with that ribbing, those shouldn't be falling down. So that sounds like those are a little too big for you. So I would have a couple questions there. Did your gauge match pre or post blocking? So did you do your gauge swatch but didn't block it and it matched? Because they could have grown after blocking, especially with sock yarn, especially if it was superwash. And if that's not the case and your gauge does match, that to me sounds like you should probably go down a needle size unless the foot fits really well and it's just the leg portion, in which case you would probably want to do some decreases so that the leg fits better. Unless you like a slouchy, I also like to go back to my late 80s, early 90s childhood, where a lot of times we like to wear like white ribbed socks all scrunched down. So again, personal preference. But if everything else felt good and you just want that leg to be a little more snug, you have a couple options. One, you could go down a needle size so you can knit the leg a bit tighter without having to make any other modifications to the pattern. Or you could do some decreases, and what I would do is I would try to decrease out 4 stitches on each side of the leg to that way you'll get back into the 2x2 ribbing pattern that you want for that pattern. So I would just decrease that out over, let's say, I guess it depends on how loose the fit would be. Like you could do 1 decrease every row, you could do 2 decreases. Yeah, I would have to think about that. But that would be the other option, is just to decrease out some stitches so that that leg feels better. But yes, to give you specific answer, you want typically about 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters of negative ease in a sock is usually good. But again, preferences can differ, especially depending on the fabric. All right. This is a 2-part question. I'm making the weekender and using Brooklyn Tweed Shelter. I'm wearing the weekender in Brooklyn Tweed Shelter. I added 1 inch to the body and made the armhole larger. Now it looks pretty funky around the underarm, but hasn't been blocked yet. My question is, this yarn is pretty stiff. My local yarn store mentioned if I soak it in wool wash and a bit of hair conditioner, it will soften right up. That made me wonder if it would fall differently since it would be less stiff. Okay, so I'm going to answer this part first. 1, yes, I feel that this yarn absolutely softens up with washing, and I don't use hair conditioner. I just use a wool wash, and I block it in pretty darn warm water. You only want to do that if you're not going to agitate it. You don't want to felt your knits. For me, I feel very comfortable with it because I've been doing it for a long time. I don't touch them beyond just like submerging them under the warm water, and by warm I mean fairly warm. And then I just leave it in there until the water has cooled, and then I pull it out and lay it out to lay flat. But I definitely think that it softens up with blocking and wearing. I will also say that yes, it's going to change the drape. Pretty much anything you knit, the drape of it will change after blocking. So that's why it's good to do a large swatch before you start a project, so you can see how that fabric's going to change, because it will be so much different pre-blocking than post-blocking. And with this kind of a pattern, because it is, I'll untuck mine, because it is this oversized boxy shape, mine has 10 inches of positive ease, that drape is what helps it fall really nicely as you wear it, instead of looking really oversized. It just drapes nicely on the body. So I do want to just go back to and made the armhole larger. Now it looks pretty funky around the underarm. I'm wondering what you did to make the armhole larger. If you just knit it, the yoke separated from longer, that's how I would recommend making a larger armhole. And then that shouldn't do anything weird under the underarm. But again, maybe it's just pre-blocking. Maybe you're feeling like that fabric's still stiff and maybe bunching in a weird way, because otherwise once you're done, it just collapses in on itself. But yeah. Okay, the second part of the question, if the sizing and shape of a garment will be different after blocking, do you have to wait until fully finished and blocked to see how something fits, or can you get a realistic idea while the project is ongoing? So, to an extent, yes and no. So you can definitely get an idea of where it's headed. I would not judge it fully until it is completely finished and blocked, because it's amazing how even when you're knitting, let's say you're knitting a top-down sweater and you try on to check yoke depth, the neckline, everything's going to change quite a bit once you add sleeves. The sleeves of a sweater pull down that neck and the yoke, the weight of the body. There is a lot that does change, but it's not... Typically it changes it for the better, so I'll say that. So as long as you're feeling pretty good about it, then it's probably headed in the right direction. And sorry, I'm just trying to decide. My mind started going to a few different places. So I'm gonna, this is not knitting, this is sewing, but like I was just working on a pair of pants, not these ones, different pair. And I wasn't sure how they were going to look at me, so I was already kind of going into the project hesitantly. And I tried them on before putting the elastic into the waist, so I had like 4 inches of extra fabric at the top because the waistband hadn't been finished, I hadn't hemmed them. So there's a lot of things that weren't quite finished about the pants, and I tried them on and I was disappointed. I was like, oh, I don't think these are going to look good on me. I don't think they fit right, and I don't know what to do to adjust them. And I slept on it. I put it in timeout and I was like, okay, we'll work on this again tomorrow. And the next day I was like, okay, I'm just gonna finish them. And by the time I finished them, I was so happy with them. So I do think that sometimes you really just can't tell until you have finished it completely where it's gonna end up. And you might get surprised, but you can definitely get a general idea. And I think that the more you work on sweaters, the more you will start to see, you'll be able to tell like, okay, I know this is going to change more after I finish it and I block it, but this is headed in the right direction. So I'm sorry, that's a vague answer, but it's kind of the best I've got. Yeah, sorry. I wish I had better advice in there, but you snuck in a part 3 to this question, which is, if I have fully blocked and soaked, but don't like the fit, can I pull it out and begin again? Or will the yarn change too much through the soaking process in wool wash and conditioner? I should add, I do check gauge and block swatches and can't figure out why things aren't fitting quite right. Thanks so much. Okay, so yes, you 100% can use that yarn again. I have never done the conditioner thing, but even that, I mean, it shouldn't affect the yarn to a point where you can't use it again. So that is the great thing about being a knitter, is you 100%. I have told the story many times. I knit a sweater years ago, wore it for a while, and just realized this fit just isn't me. I'm not reaching for it because I don't feel confident in it. And I decided to take it out and reuse that yarn for a different project. And so you can 100% do that. You might want to, after you've unraveled it, either wet that yarn or steam that yarn to help get the kinks out of your knitting, because it will be very kinky. So yes, you can begin again. As far as your fit goes, I would recommend maybe going into your closet and finding if you have any ready-to-wear sweaters or other sweaters you've knit that you really, really love. Go in and measure those, and that might help answer any fit issues you're having. If you can compare those measurements to the sweaters you've been attempting to knit, look at the schematic, see if those measurements should be the same. Also, another thing I will say, and I feel this way for knits and sews, so my clothes I've sewn, my clothes I've knit, I 100% believe that they also tend to start feeling better, looking better, fitting better after a few wears. It's like they relax into your body and into your daily use. And so that's something to consider too, is like giving it a little while, wear it for a bit, and really let it kind of fall in to its true shape. Let it achieve its destiny before you decide it's not working. At least I have found that to be really helpful. All right. Oh no. I cut off one of the questions. Darn it. All right. I remember it though, so I'm not gonna be able to read it perfectly, but I'll be able to do it justice, hopefully. Okay. I love this because this person said that every Friday my dog and I snuggle up and watch your latest episode. That's so cute. Oh, I love dogs. Okay. I am curious about the inclinations cowl that you're knitting up for your daughter. And so they're asking some tips about making it smaller, which I answered in the first question. But another question they wanted to ask was, you talked about yarns and pilling before. If I understand correctly, a single ply is more likely to pill faster. So if I am knitting a sweater that calls for a fingering weight yarn, would I be better off choosing a sock yarn? Yes, if you are concerned about pilling, then a sock yarn generally is going to pill less than a single ply yarn, because that ply, getting that spin on there, helps to lock in those fibers more strongly so that they aren't going to come out and cause little pills. That being said, I have knit a couple sweaters with single ply yarns. My pink velvet sweater calls for a single ply yarn, but it also has, I think it's a merino yak and maybe silk blend, if I'm remembering correctly, from Ching Fibers, and that has held up super well. Very minimal pilling on that. So while it is a good guide, just remember nothing's a hard and fast rule, and that's when you could try doing the just knitting a strip and seaming it together and just wearing it on your wrist or throwing it in your purse and kind of seeing how that does for a week or so to see if it starts pilling, and that'll kind of give you a good idea. All right, so I am so sorry I'm gonna yawn right now. Oh, my apologies. I did not sleep well last night. I had one of those nights where I felt like I woke up, I felt like I was in like that weird nap place where you are aware of your surroundings, but you know you're kind of dozing and dreaming too. And then I'd wake up like every 5 minutes and my brain would just turn on and not be quiet. So I'm a little tired today, so I apologize for yawning. All right, so the last question here is about the Gimp sweater, and this is the one that I cut off. So my apologies to the person who put in your wonderful question about the Gimp sweater. But basically they were wondering if they had to do the short rows in the ribbed collar of that sweater. So I do. Oh, I tap my shoulder and I'm like, I don't know about the rest of y'all, but I do get all like the knots that I get in my back from knitting are all like right here. I can feel them. I digress. So they were wondering about, for that sweater, I put the short row back neck shaping into the ribbing of the collar. And I did that specifically because I felt like it would be more challenging for people to work those short rows in pattern, in that knit purl pattern with the cabling and everything that was going on, because those short rows would have gone over your cabled raglans as well. And so if you feel really, really comfortable with short rows and you feel comfortable staying in pattern, you could absolutely try moving them to below the collar. You know, the other option that a lot of times designers will do, especially for like a colorwork yoke sweater or something like that, is we just do a stockinette section and then we'll go into the yoke. It would have been really, really disruptive in the Gimp sweater to do that, because it would have been that ribbed collar and then you would have had kind of a funky stockinette section and then all the texture and everything. So I, again, visually did not like the way that would have looked. So I would either keep them where they are, or you could attempt the short rows, move them down into the stitch pattern, and just know that you're going to be doing short rows and shaping all at once, and staying in pattern with the cables and the knit purl. So if you try it, sorry, now I have something in my eye. If you try it, definitely let me know how it goes. All right, well, that is it. It has to be it, because I just cut everything else off. But that was the last question anyway, so I think we're good. And I already talked about the knit along and what I'm wearing. So I hope that you will participate in the knit along this weekend. I would love to see you over in the forums or on Instagram. The link for the forum and the Instagram hashtag are both below. If you are a newsletter subscriber, make sure to check your inbox, because I sent out a newsletter yesterday for the kickoff of the knit along, and it includes a flash sale. So you don't want to miss out on that, and it ends tonight at midnight Eastern Standard Time. I think that's it. I hope that you have a lovely weekend. I hope you get to do some making, and I hope to see you back here next Friday. Bye.